Welcome back to Videos from the Ville. This is Dr. Charles Greenewalt from Millersville University in the Government Department, and this is Canadian Government and Politics. Today we want to take a look at the Canadian Judiciary. Okay? I'd like you to go ahead and get your PowerPoints out. If you've copied them, you can have them in your hand and follow along, or you can be looking at your PowerPoints on your laptop and follow along that way. But I think you'll get more out of the presentation if you do follow along with your PowerPoints. Okay, let's take a look at first the nature of judicial power. If we're going to study the Canadian judiciary, what is the nature of judicial power as opposed to executive or legislative power, which we've looked at previously? Well, the first thing that we have to remember is that the judiciary needs to be independent. And judicial independence is a very important part of the Canadian judicial scene. By talking about judicial independence, we mean the lack of political direction, the lack of political control over the courts by any outside body, including the whole panoply of legislative and executive organizations. You have in the parliamentary system, as we've seen previously, a fusion, a joining of executive and legislative powers, but you find that this does not extend to the judiciary. This does not extend to the judiciary in Canada. You find that judicial independence in Canada is designed to prevent any one person or any one institution from telling the courts what their rulings should be or what the content of the rulings should be. This again stresses that the courts must be non-political. The courts must be non-political. Well, there's other elements that go into the nature of judicial power. One, of course, is judicial independence. Another is legal immunity. And legal immunity is talking about the fact that we can reinforce the independence of the judiciary by giving the judges legal immunity from the consequences of their decisions. If the judges somewhere along the line make an incorrect ruling in carrying out their official duties, they cannot be sued as individuals. We find that in addition to legal immunity, another element of the nature of judicial power is that judicial independence is reinforced by judicial tenure and judicial salaries. The judges are appointed for very long terms of office, or the judges are appointed for life. Once appointed, the judges can be removed only for, quote, cause, unquote. In other words, cause is some type of illegal behavior. Judicial salaries, on the other hand, they cannot be moved either up or down. So we can't bring political pressure to bear against judges by threatening them with moving their salaries down. We also, the nature of judicial power in Canada, we have to remember that judicial responsibilities and functions are shared. Judicial responsibilities and functions are shared. They're federalized between the national government, or the federal government, and the provincial governments. Next, each province has the power to determine the organization of its own court system. Every province has the power to determine the organization of its own court system. Can you imagine in the United States if every state had the power to determine the organization of its court system? And then you have the hierarchical structure with three levels. You have a hierarchical structure with three levels. You have federal, provincial, and lesser provincial courts. Let's look at the structure of the court system. The federal court system. What is in the federal courts in Canada? You have the Supreme Court and you have the Federal Court of Canada. That's what's found at the federal level. The Supreme Court and the Federal Court of Canada. On the provincial level, we have the Provincial Supreme Court, the Superior Court, the county court, and district courts. So at the provincial level, we have the provincial Supreme Court, the Superior Court, county court, and district courts. And then we have lesser provincial courts. Lesser provincial courts are made up of traffic courts and family courts. So again, the hierarchical structure of the court system in Canada has three levels. The federal level, where you have the Supreme Court and the Federal Court of Canada. The provincial level, where you have the Provincial Supreme Court, the Superior Court, the County Court, and the District Courts. And you have the lesser provincial courts, which are comprised of traffic and family courts. Now, the responsibilities for the structure of the courts is divided, as we said, between the national government and the provincial governments. You have the national government controlling the federal courts. The provincial government controls the minor courts. And intermediate level courts, intermediate level courts are shared. Intermediate level courts are shared. For example, the provinces may determine the number and the structure of major provincial courts, but the federal government will determine the appointment, the tenure, and the salary. So intermediate level courts are shared. The provinces may determine the number and the structure of major provincial courts, but the federal government will decide who sits on those courts, how long they serve, and what their salary is. In total, Ottawa, the national government, they choose about 800 different judges. Defining the law's content. Defining law's content is also federalized. The national government is granted the right to determine criminal code and procedures, while the provinces are given powers over civil procedures. So again, what we find in Canada as a result of the compromises between the French and the British at the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, is that I find the national government is granted the right to determine the criminal code and the procedures in the criminal code, and the provinces were allocated powers over civil procedures. Hierarchical court structure that we find throughout Canada is presided over by the Supreme Court of Canada. So the Supreme Court of Canada presides over a hierarchical court structure. And you see a picture in your PowerPoints of the Supreme Court of Canada in session in Ottawa. Whereas at the beginning of the presentation, you saw a picture of the Supreme Court building in Ottawa, which is just, if you're facing Parliament when you're in Ottawa, and you're facing it towards the Ottawa River, you'll find that the Supreme Court building is just to the left of the Parliament building. Well, the Supreme Court of Canada was created in 1875, and it was created under authority granted to the Canadian Parliament that provided for the establishment of a, quote, General Court of Appeal, unquote, for Canada. The Supreme Court only became the highest court of appeal for constitutional cases in 1949. So the Supreme Court only became the highest court of appeal for constitutional cases in 1949. Until this point in time, we find that the ultimate court of appeal for Canadian cases actually resided in London. It resided in Great Britain, and it was under the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. So the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council was the highest court of appeal for Canadian constitutional cases until 1949. We find that when you look at the Canadian judiciary, the composition of the Canadian judiciary is largely patronage-based, particularly at the lower levels. You get to be a leading Canadian politician, there's a judgeship in your future. We find that patronage has been pervasive in the Canadian judiciary throughout Canadian history, but yet it's almost never become a subject of sustained interest or study within Canada itself. It's some mind-boggling for some of us to try to understand that. You find that since Canada does have a patronage-based selection process to choose judges, we find that they revised their procedure for choosing judges in 1989. In 1989, all persons being considered for a judgeship are now given a review by a judicial committee, and this judicial committee is made up of, quote, nonpartisan, unquote, nonpartisan members that represent the Canadian Bar Association, the Provincial Law Society, and the federal and provincial governments. So now, in order to try to downplay the patronage nature of the Canadian judiciary, all the individuals who are considered for a judgeship and are chosen for a judgeship must pass muster with this new judicial committee that is found in every province, made up of these nonpartisan members that represent the Canadian Bar Association, the Provincial Law Society, and the federal and provincial governments. Well, this new procedure has indeed done away with the most blatant examples of judicial patronage. We find that partisan abuses are seen much less with the Supreme Court of Canada, but we find the selection of members to the Canadian Supreme Court is still political, and it's still political by virtue of the fact that the ideological views of the various appointees are scrutinized very carefully by the government. The government is not going to appoint someone to a Supreme Court position unless they have some understanding of their ideological predisposition. You also find that in court selections there are a number of other factors that are figured in to the calculus. Just as in America, you'll find that other elements such as race, gender, ethnicity, education, and social class, they're all factored into the equation. Women have been historically underrepresented. Women have really come a long way in the Canadian judiciary in recent decades, but they have traditionally been underrepresented. In 1977 finds the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia. There's also a concern in Canada over French-speaking versus English-speaking representation. Since 1985, 2 of the 25 positions on the Federal Court of Canada have been reserved for French speakers. So since 1985, 2 of the 25 positions, 8, did I say 2? I meant 8. Since 1985, 8 of the 25 positions on the Federal Court of Canada must be held by French speakers. Quebec is guaranteed 3 of 9 seats on the Canadian Supreme Court. That way, if you have 3 of 9 seats being given to Quebec, there will always be judges that will be familiar with Quebec's civil law tradition. The Supreme Court of Canada itself consists of 9 judges. Just like in the United States, there is a Chief Justice. So the Chief Justice directs and presides over the court. The workload of the court is less than here we have in the United States, of course, but the workload generally averages about 100 cases per year. A quorum in the case of the Canadian Supreme Court is 5 out of 9. 5 out of 9. And appointment qualifications, you have to have at least 10 years of practice as a lawyer. You must have 10 years of practice as a lawyer, or you must be a member of a provincial superior court. So in order to be appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada, you must have at least 10 years of practice as a lawyer or barrister, or you have to be a member of the provincial superior court. What are some of the other conventions or customs of the Canadian Supreme Court? Just like Quebec is guaranteed 3 seats, Ontario is guaranteed 3 seats as well. Ontario is guaranteed 3 seats. So that's 6 out of 9. That means that the Atlantic provinces get 1 member, and the Western provinces get 2. So the Atlantic provinces would include then Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. They would have 1 person, and in the Western provinces, they get 2 members. 1 will always come from British Columbia, and 1 from the prairies, 1 from Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Manitoba. Well, when we look at as we look at the Supreme Court of Canada, and we look at the Canadian Judiciary, we look at the Canadian Judiciary since 1867, with the British North American Act, you find that there are 3 elements that reign supreme in the functioning of the Canadian court system. In the functioning of the Canadian court system, you'll always find judicial independence, limited judicial review, and judicial restraint. So you'll have judicial independence, limited judicial review, and judicial restraint. Now again, judicial review in Canada means something different than it means in the United States. Limited judicial review means that the court simply will tell the Canadian governments what level of government has jurisdiction, has the right, if you will, to solve a problem. Will it be a provincial government that will be given free rein in an area, or will it be the federal government, the national government, that's given free rein or given the predominant role in decision-making on a certain issue? That is what limited judicial review is, specifying which level of government should reign supreme in or lead the decision-making in one area or another. So the broad functioning of the Canadian judiciary from 1867 to the current time is judicial independence, limited judicial review, and judicial restraint. Judicial restraint. Now, if we want to, I've tried to tell you what the court system looks like. Here, I'll put this schematic up to the camera, and of course you've gotten it in your PowerPoint, so you've seen it. But I want you to take a look and make sure you understand the overview of the Canadian court system, the overview of Canada's court system, where it lists the federal courts being the Supreme Court and the federal court, the provincial superior trial courts, the Court of Appeal of the province and the provincial superior courts, and lastly the provincial courts, which would be the provincial court of the province and municipal courts. Let me put this up again so you can take a good look at that again. Okay, well, this is our treatment. This is our discussion on the Canadian judiciary. If you have questions, be sure to email me. Be sure to call me, and I'm happy to discuss anything with you. I look forward to those discussions. Otherwise, I'll see you next time with another presentation from Canadian Government and Politics.